Welcome to the Realist Review. I'm James Carden. I first came across the name of my guest today about a decade ago, reading Foreign Affairs, and it was an astonishing piece of work. It demolished the justification that Susan Rice and the Obama administration gave for the intervention in Libya. This person's name is Alan Kuperman, a professor of public affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He has written, I think, rather bravely and forthrightly on a number of issues, including Ukraine, Gaza, Libya, and is a trenchant critic of the policy of humanitarian intervention. Alan, really appreciate you taking the time to talk. One of the things I think that perhaps American involvement in the aforementioned areas plus Syria has to do with sort of media myths created by sitting administrations in order to justify their intervention. So one of the more obvious ones is the Libyan intervention. We were told certain things that turned out not to be the case. So in March of 2011, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1973 establishing a no-fly zone over Libya. Um, President Obama later said that we knew that if we waited one more day, Benghazi, a city nearly the size of Charlotte, could suffer a massacre that would have reverberated across the region and stained the conscience of the world. Um, you wrote, however, about 10 years ago in Foreign Affairs that that verdict turned out to have been premature. In retrospect, Obama's intervention in Libya was an abject failure, judged even by its own standards. Libya has not only failed to evolve into a democracy, has devolved into a failed state. Was Libya, do you think, sort of a harbinger of things to come? In other words, after Libya came Syria, and then, in a sense, though we weren't directly involved in Ukraine, it seems like subsequent American administrations made the same mistake over and over again without learning very much. What is your view?
Well, I would say that Libya was not the first time this had happened, and as you suggest, it wasn't the last time that it had happened. There's been a pattern, at least since the end of the Cold War, um, of folks in other countries who want us to intervene on their behalf, and they say to themselves, how can we get the US to intervene on our behalf? And generally what they have to do is either provoke violence against themselves so they can say, look how much we're suffering, please save us, or uh, exaggerate via disinformation the nature of the violence that's against them. So let's say they provoke the government to retaliate, and gosh darn it, the government only retaliates against combatants, not against civilians. Then these people can't cry, oh, there's a genocide, there's massacres. So then they have to lie and fabricate these sorts of allegations of atrocities. So now you have folks in the West, and it's folks in Western governments, and it's folks in Western media, and they are usually not in on the con initially. They are dupes, but they take it hook, line, and sinker, and they report these horrible things that are happening. It's these completely innocent people that did nothing wrong, and all of a sudden the government, for no good reason, is about to commit a genocide against them. And the only thing that can stop this is Western military intervention. And then the West intervenes and generally winds up making things worse. So, I talk about two different negative impacts or pathologies of this Western tendency to intervene. First of all, we give rise to the violent conflict in the first place, because the reason these folks start it, why do they start a rebellion they can't win, is because they think they can attract us. So we trigger the start of the violence, and then we come in allegedly to ameliorate or prevent a genocide, but there wasn't going to be a genocide because that was disinformation. But our intervention, boy, oh boy, does that fuel the fire of the Civil War. So that compared to the violence that would have occurred without our intervention, the violence with our intervention is much worse. So we trigger the outbreak of violence, and then we exacerbate the extent of violence and the toll against civilians. So
Well,
I will say, I am not in principle against the notion of humanitarian military intervention. I got into this whole line of research because I thought there are certain cases where there really is a genocide, is massive ethnic cleansing. It's going to get worse, and the US has much greater military capacity. And if we use it properly, we could, at very low cost to ourselves, save tens or hundreds of thousands of people from suffering, rape, displacement, and all sorts of stuff. And my values say that's worth doing. The problem I found out is that we turn out not to be very good at it. And and even worse, the two things I mentioned, we wind up incentivizing this sort of violence, and then our intervention winds up exacerbating this sort of violence. So I do still think there is a role for humanitarian military intervention in the world. I think it would be in very few cases, and I would do it differently than we have done it.
I think, you mentioned Rwanda as one of those cases in your foreign affairs article. I think one of the things that is kind of striking is that a lot of the people who were in charge during the Obama administration were at kind of mid to middle high level positions during the Clinton administration, and they maybe overlearned that lesson, that the failure of Rwanda, or they were afraid of repeating that elsewhere.
Well, I mean, Susan Rice's Exhibit A there, she was in charge of Africa on the National Security Council, and she was one of those who opposed intervening in Rwanda in the spring of 1994. Like, we can't intervene everywhere, we just got our nose bloodied in Somalia, so let's stay out of this. And as a result, over 500,000 civilians got killed, and this is a stain on her conscience. And so, as you say, she overreacted, so that now she has supported these interventions to stop genocides where there weren't genocides. But our intervention, sure as hell, wound up resulting in the deaths of thousands and thousands of civilians.
So you mentioned that humanitarian intervention can sometimes, or oftentimes, makes things worse on the ground. I think it also makes things harder down the line for us. And what I have in mind is the part of the article where you talk about the broader backlash to what happened in Libya. In other words, a lot of Americans don't know that Gaddafi was sort of cooperating with us in the decades before.
In fact, we now cite him as the model of
Yeah.
cooperation. We say you got to do what Gaddafi did. You have to totally give up your nuclear weapons program, and he did. And he allowed us to come in, put it in boxes, put it on planes, and ship it the hell out of there. And his reward for giving up his nuclear weapons program was that 8 years later, we helped overthrow him by rebels who then tortured and assassinated him. And so what that does is it sends a terrible message to other countries with nuclear programs, or who might get nuclear programs, which is to say, we shouldn't give up our nuclear program. We should accelerate our nuclear weapons program, because that's the only way to defend yourself from American intervention, American imperialism, American regime change.
Right.
So that was a real negative consequence. Another huge negative consequence was the spillover and growth of radical Islam. And what happened is that Gaddafi had relied on a whole bunch of people of mixed heritage, but especially from Mali. And when he was overthrown, those troops went back to Mali. And what did they do? They started a civil war in their country. And then that civil war wound up getting hijacked by radical Islamists who took over most of Mali and created the largest safe haven for radical Islamists in the world at that time, which is saying something. And that has continued to this day, that has continued to be a problem. And the radical Islamist movements in Mali have spilled over to, West Africa, to the rest of the Sahel. And it's just an absolute disaster. And even that was exacerbated by the fact that when we overthrew Gaddafi, all his weapons got sold and exported and helped fuel civil wars, radical Islam, shooting down planes, surface to air missiles that he had, wound up shooting down planes across Africa and the Middle East. So, yeah, what I say is that oftentimes when we do these things wrong, which is a lot of the time, we make things worse for the country itself, where we're intervening, and for ourselves,
I think
for our own security interests.
we're certainly seeing some of that today with Iran, where Trump it now seems puzzled why it's so difficult to come to an agreement with the Iranians, probably not remembering what happened in Libya, but he seems to be letting himself off the hook a little bit because, we were the ones who tore up the JCPOA, and now, he and his
Not we,
what
he's
that's
the
right.
one. So I will say, I work a lot on nuclear weapons proliferation. I was not a fan of the JCPOA's language. I thought we could have gotten a much better deal. I thought Obama was a very bad negotiator. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a, knee-jerk critic of Democrats by any means, but I thought Obama was just a very weak negotiator. He always tipped off how much he wanted the deal, and then the other side, once they know you want the deal, then they don't have to compromise at all. As I always tell my students, if you go and buy a rug in a Middle Eastern market, don't show enthusiasm for the market because for the rug, because if you do, you will pay the highest price possible. They know you're not leaving the market without the rug, so they can just keep the price high. You have to say, it's not the best rug in the world. It's got a little stain here, a little tear here. It's not exactly the color I wanted. Okay, I'll see. I got to go catch my bus. And as you're walking out the market, then they say, okay, we'll cut the price in half, right? So that's what you would have had to do with Iran. You would have had to say, we don't really want this deal. We kind of wouldn't mind bombing you. Had Obama done that, he would have gotten a much better deal. Anyway, the deal wasn't a great deal, but once we had the deal, that was better than tearing up the deal. And so Trump came in and tore up the deal. And what all that did was give a green light for Iran to massively escalate and accelerate its enrichment program, such that it today could produce, a half dozen bombs worth of highly enriched uranium in a month or so. So, yeah. So, but it's Trump, not us. It's Trump who tore up that deal.
An interesting point that you just made about bargaining. I wonder if it would be a good idea for all graduate students who are studying negotiations take a trip to Istanbul and go to the
Absolutely.
bar, which is a real life lesson in what that's about.
Absolutely.
I I think that you mentioned this again in your excellent foreign affairs article about Obama learning the wrong lessons, and I'm just going to read briefly from it. Obama also acknowledges regrets about Libya, but unfortunately, he's drawn the wrong lesson. I think we underestimated, he said, the need to come in full force, he told the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman in August of 2014. If you're going to do this, he elaborated, there has to be a much more aggressive effort to rebuild societies. And around 2014, it was the spring of 2014 when we were unfortunately beginning our long involvement in Ukraine, which is where I would like to turn next. You wrote,
So just to underscore that, right, as you're implying, the mistake wasn't that after destroying Libya, we didn't rebuild it. The mistake was destroying Libya. So you don't have to do the rebuilding if you don't destroy a country. And we destroyed that country. In fact, we destroyed a region. So sorry to interrupt, but it just
not at all. Well, no, it's really quite amazing. I mean, you had in 2009, General William Ward, the head of the U.S. Command in Africa, call you Libya a top partner in combating transnational terrorism. My God. So the
yeah,
lessons,
we flipped him. We flipped Gaddafi from being a bad guy to being our strongest ally in the war on terror. And, again, his reward was that we killed him. So when you ask, Iran and Syria, oh, just come out of the cold and be a good guy and we'll treat you right, you know, I think they're going to hedge. Right? They'll give up their enrichment program, but they will have a secret enrichment program in the basement.
yeah.
Okay.
Um, so turning to Ukraine, this was your article. I think it was in March in the Hill. Um, was pretty astonishing to me as someone who follows post-Soviet affairs fairly carefully. Um, your second paragraph kind of blew me away because it was something that, you know, me and my colleagues have understood for a very long time, but I couldn't quite believe I was reading it in the Hill.
In
Uh,
polite company.
well, yeah. And so I thought that took some amount of courage on your part to do, given how vicious the debate over Russia and Ukraine has been over the past decade. Um, so you start out by noting correctly, Western audiences have been fed a steady diet of disinformation about Ukraine for more than a decade, and it's time to set the record straight on three key points. The first point, which is really what caught my attention, was that you note that overwhelming forensic evidence shows, and it's been affirmed by a court in Kyiv, that it was right-wing militants, in other words, anti-Russian militants, who started the violence in 2014 on the Maidan. Could you talk about what you mean by, or what you're referring to by the forensic evidence, and what is your understanding of what occurred in February of
I'd
20?
be happy to. I'll start by telling you how I came to discover this. And it's not I alone who discovered this, but I was following the events very carefully in 2013, 2014. As you recall, there was a massive occupation by a largely peaceful group of protesters in the capital, in Kyiv. And they were protesting because they had elected a government in free and fair elections that was known to be pro Russia, right? Because people don't know this, but there was a roughly 50-50 split of the electorate in Ukraine. Those who were more pro Russia in the south and east of the country, and those who were more pro West, pro EU in the center, north, and west of the country. And what happened in elections is that they would sort of pendulum would swing from the one election they would elect the pro EU candidate, then the economy would be bad, and they say, oh, let's elect the pro Russia candidate, and so forth. Anyway, in the preceding election, they had freely and fairly elected the pro Russia candidate, and even though he was pro Russia, he was negotiating a trade deal with the EU, and Putin wanted Ukraine instead to have a trade deal with Russia. So he prevailed upon the president of Ukraine to abandon the negotiations for the EU trade deal and instead forge a trade deal with Russia. Well, the folks in the north and west of Ukraine, who were pro-EU, were very upset about that. They wanted this deal with the EU, not with Russia. So they came in and occupied the central square in Kiev. Okay. This was, exceedingly disruptive for the government and for the society. But to his credit, the president of Ukraine did not respond to this with overwhelming violence. And eventually there came to be negotiations, and I'm reading this in the paper each day. And finally, the protesters win. The peaceful protesters win. And the pro-Russian president of Ukraine says, okay, I am going to make the following reforms that you have demanded. And the protesters say, we won, we won. And they overwhelmingly leave. Who didn't leave? The radical Ukrainian protesters who found this compromise unacceptable. And so what happened is that they remained, and other extremists from elsewhere in the north and west of Ukraine rolled into the square, and they initiated violence against not only the government forces who were defending government buildings, but also against a few remaining peaceful protesters in the square. So how do we know this? I will first say that I was reading the paper. Okay, deal is made, protesters leave, everything's hunky-dory, wonderful. And then a couple days later, there's reports government has decided to use overwhelming force and kill 100 peaceful protesters in the square. And now everyone is outraged in Ukraine, and they're descending on the capital, and the president is fearful for his life, and he's fled the capital. Where has he gone? And it turns out he's gone to Russia for safekeeping. And there's been an overthrow of the government. Okay, and I say to myself, but I don't get this. They made a deal. The government had conceded. The peaceful protesters had left. What the hell happened? And it was about a couple years later that I was at an obscure academic conference, and I saw a presentation by a originally Ukrainian academic who had moved to the US, gotten his PhD here, and he had gotten all the video and all of the photographic evidence that was available. And he'd gotten audio recordings so that you could, synchronize these videos and so forth. And he got forensic evidence, like from which direction did the bullets enter these folks? From which direction were they fired? And what he found in deconstructing this was that the bullets that had killed the protesters had not been fired from the direction where the government forces were defending government buildings, but instead had been fired from buildings on the side of the square that were occupied by the protesters and by the radical protesters.
Now, sorry to interrupt, but just to be clear, you're talking about Ivan Kachanovsky of the University of Ottawa, correct?
Correct. Now at the University of Ottawa, correct. And so, I was like, aha! Like, what? I was wondering what happened on those 2 or 3 days.
Right.
We had a deal, and then all of a sudden, if I'm the government and the protesters concede and they allow me to stay in office, I'm not going to then massacre the remaining protesters, because that makes no sense, right? But if they start firing at my forces, well, yes, I have to return fire. That makes sense. But I would be returning fire at the people firing bullets, not at the peaceful protesters. So how did the peaceful protesters get killed? And what Kachanovsky found is that the peaceful protesters were shot, not all of them, but the majority of the ones where he could identify how they got shot, they were shot by the Maidan protester the radical Maidan protester occupied buildings on the side of the square, that
Right.
the bullets had entered from
Uh,
a high altitude. And if I'm a protester facing the government forces, the bullets came from the side or the back,
yep.
not from where the government forces were. And he's continued to do that research, to refine that research, and he finally published in a book, I think it was last year. And now that's a brave guy.
Yes, indeed.
Um, that's a brave guy. So anyway, um, and what that means is that this, and so what happened when the president was overthrown in this way by these radical nationalist, right-wing nationalist Ukrainians, is that then the new Ukrainian government started doing things like, we're going to ban the Russian language, et cetera, et cetera. And, as I said, about half of Ukraine had voted for, more than half had voted for the pro-Russia president. So it doesn't mean they all view themselves as ethnic Russians. It doesn't even mean they view themselves that their first language is Russian, although for a lot of them, their first language is Russian. But it meant that they, had some connection to Russia, Russia the country, Russia the language, Russia the culture. Historically, that part of the country had been connected to Russia for much longer than it had been connected to Ukraine. I'm not saying that Russia has a right to have it or anything like that, but these folks felt very threatened by this new political legislative agenda from this new government that had overthrown the pro-Russia president. And so many of them were fearful for their culture, their identity, their way of life, their security. And Putin used this as a rationale to say, well, I'm going to, you can use violence, extremist Ukrainian nationalists, you can use violence to overthrow a democratically elected Russian government and try and purge the Russian identity of Ukraine. Well, I can also use violence to protect these folks who now feel threatened by your policies. I'm not justifying what he did. I'm not saying that the rationale he gave was sincere. But I'm also, what I say in the piece is, it's laughable to say that Russia's invasion was unprovoked.
Well,
It
completely.
was it was extravagantly provoked by
And
these extremist nationalist Ukrainian militants.
at the time, and I think it was on Charlie Rose, my late friend, Stephen F. Cohen, said that the overthrow of a democratic government isn't democracy. It's the opposite of democracy. And that made him very unpopular. But, it turns out that the people who were calling the shots on the Maidan were, as Putin, I think, accurately describes them, as not the nicest people on earth. You had people like Andrei Perubi of Right Sector, and they pinned the killings on the members of the Berkut special police services. When I traveled to Donbass in 2015, I met with these people who really, for them, the last straw was um, the pinning of the shootings, of the massacres
Interesting.
on the Berkut, because they primarily came from that area. That's a very working class, very industrial area, and a lot of them went into the Berkut to kind of better themselves. It's not a dissimilar story to what we have in the United States. Um, and they were outraged by this. And one of them told me there's no going back to Ukraine now. So that was pretty obvious back then. Um, in the time remaining, which is about 5 minutes or so, um, I want to talk about another important point that you made, and that's with regard to the failed Minsk process. Now, if I open the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Atlantic, I'm going to read that Vladimir Putin subverted and ultimately never sought to take seriously Minsk 1 and 2, and the failure of the peace process um, was his and his alone. I'm not sure that that's the whole story. I was wondering if you might elaborate on your view of what what tanked Minsk?
Well, I think you have to start with um, what was Putin's concern. And as I mentioned before, he had been hoping that he was going to get Ukraine into um, an economic alliance with Russia. That's what he had been hoping for in 2013. And then through, this false flag operation by these, extremist Ukrainian nationalists who blamed the pro-Russian government for starting a massacre when in fact it was the Ukrainian nationalists that provoked and committed the massacre. As a result of that, not only was Putin not going to have an economic alliance with Ukraine, Ukraine was going to have an economic alliance with the EU, but even worse, Putin started to fear that the West would finally live up to its pledge to bring Ukraine into NATO. And that was, unacceptable for him. That had been unacceptable for him since 2007. He'd made clear, he's like, okay, Russia was weak after the Cold War. I get it. So, NATO gobbled up all these former Warsaw Pact countries. Nothing Russia could do. Okay. And then NATO started gobbling up these former Soviet republics in the Baltics, etc. He's like, okay, there's nothing we could do. Okay, but now Russia is stronger, and NATO now you're encroaching on what we view as our vital interests, and that's Ukraine and Georgia. And Putin, I mean, he didn't make this a secret. He came out in big speeches, 2007, 2008, saying, no, this is my red line. Don't cross this red line. And now he saw this red line being crossed as a result of this coup that overthrew the democratically elected pro-Russia government of Ukraine. And so he sends these forces and he supports local forces to take Crimea and to occupy and control much of part of the Donbass, let's say. And this is his leverage to try to ensure an outcome in which Ukraine cannot join NATO. And in certain two moments in 2014 and 2015, the Ukrainian forces were in extremis, in danger. And Putin used that as leverage to get agreements with them. And what the agreement said, the key provision, in my view, of the agreements, what I think Putin was most excited about, was that the Donbass would have a higher level of political autonomy within Ukraine, such that Ukraine could not join NATO because these two areas would not support that decision. And I think he viewed that as a very low-cost way of achieving his minimum acceptable outcome.
Yep.
So that's what Minsk said. And the Ukrainians signed that on the dotted line, and they said that they would implement this political autonomy by the end of the year. That was 2015. Didn't happen in 2015. Didn't happen in 2016. Didn't so in 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21. Okay. And not only was Ukraine not implementing this autonomy for the pro-Russia regions of Ukraine, but Ukraine starts increasing its imports of military equipment from NATO. So now he sees, oh, so I'm not going to get the political guarantee against Ukraine joining NATO, and Ukraine is acquiring weapons so that they can get a fait accompli of militarily asserting their joining NATO. And it's at that point that he launches his military intervention, second military intervention in February 2022. So, as I say in the article, not only could Ukraine have avoided the second Russian military invasion in 2022 by implementing Minsk, but that that outcome, if they implemented Minsk too, the 2015 agreement, that outcome would have been much better for Ukraine than will be any future outcome for Ukraine. Whatever it is that they're negotiating now in Turkey or wherever they're going to negotiate will be a much, much worse deal for Ukraine than Ukraine could have had simply by honoring the commitments they'd made at the negotiating table. So it's a real own goal for Ukraine. And it's one of the reasons, not the only reason, that I don't view Zelensky as this great hero um, of Ukraine. He came into power with, you know,
A mandate.
90 over 95% of Ukraine in his power, in his under his sovereignty, and as a result of his being a very poor politician, he's lost, now control of 20% of his country. And that was completely avoidable because, Putin didn't want a war. What Putin wanted was to assure that Ukraine would be a friendly country rather than an adversary country. And only when Ukraine refused to do it, like the old commercial, we can do it the easy way, we can do it the hard way, right? So Ukraine refused to provide that the easy way. So Putin says, okay, now we're going to do it the hard way. Did Putin want this? I don't think so. I don't think he wanted a huge invasion. I don't think he wanted huge sanctions. I don't think he wanted this huge divide. I don't think he wanted to be pushed into the arms of China, which is a historical adversary of Russia. But he was not going to let Ukraine join
That's
NATO.
that's exactly right. The taproot of the problem is, of course, NATO expansion. Unfortunately, I have to leave it here. I really appreciate you doing this, and it's finally nice to meet you after having read you for many
Likewise,
years.
likewise.
Thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure.